When I first bought my property 15 years ago, the creek behind my land felt like a quiet blessing. It wasn't big or dramatic, but it served an essential purpose that everyone in the neighborhood understood even if they rarely spoke about it. The gentle flow carried storm runoff from the higher terrain, preventing the luxury homes built later from sinking into soft, oversaturated soil. Over time, developers built around it, and eventually the HOA formed, but the creek remained the unacknowledged backbone of the area. I maintained it carefully, clearing fallen branches and making sure water could travel freely. That creek had existed there long before any HOA board or million-dollar house, and it was part of the land's natural design. Everything changed when a new set of HOA board members moved in, people obsessed with trimming anything natural out of existence unless it could be cataloged, measured, and approved. They called my creek an aesthetic disruption and insisted it spoiled the symmetry of their backyard views. I tried explaining that it wasn't merely decorative, it was a functional drainage system. They smiled politely in that patronizing HOA way that always signals they've already decided you're wrong. They told me the creek needed to be addressed, though they refused to say what that meant. Then came the morning I woke to heavy machinery roaring like thunder at dawn. 3 trucks had rolled onto my land, a cement mixer churned aggressively, and laborers were already dumping wet concrete into the flowing water. They had cut through my fence and claimed they had full neighborhood authorization. I shouted that they were trespassing, but they ignored me completely. By the time the sheriff arrived, the creek was buried, and the damage was done. Began the moment the concrete hardened and the HOA realized their bold improvement project wasn't going according to plan. At first, they strutted around proudly, acting as if they had eliminated a nuisance and elevated neighborhood property values. They sent out emails praising their initiative, claiming they had resolved a long-standing drainage issue. They even took photos of the freshly poured concrete as if it were a work of art. But nature doesn't care about HOA newsletters. Within 48 hours, rain rolled in, one of those slow, steady showers that normally drained effortlessly through the creek. This time, though, the water had nowhere to go. It pooled, seeped, and began moving backward across the yards of the very people who approved the HOA's plan. I watched from my porch as the first backyard turned soggy. A couple's decorative garden lights started leaning at awkward angles. By the second day, another neighbor's new patio furniture sank halfway into soft mud. They blamed the weather at first, insisting it was an unusual storm. I knew better. The HOA president still tried to dismiss it, saying the ground simply needed adjustment time. But by the third day, the truth became impossible to ignore. Water had reached the foundations of several homes, and the crawl spaces beneath them were starting to absorb moisture. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp odor of wet drywall drifted through the neighborhood. Meanwhile, I contacted the county, filing an official complaint with photos of the creek destruction. The inspector didn't sound surprised. Apparently, HOAs doing unauthorized landscaping wasn't uncommon. He scheduled a site visit and told me bluntly that tampering with natural drainage could bring serious consequences. I saved every email, every message, every time-stamped picture. The HOA thought they controlled everything, but they had no idea how big a disaster they had created or how much bigger it was about to become. Unfolded with a mix of panic, denial, and finger-pointing as the HOA struggled to understand the magnitude of the mess they had created. The county inspector arrived early in the morning, clipboard in hand, boots already muddy from trudging through the soggy yards. He didn't need long to see what had happened. The concrete-filled creek acted like a wall, blocking the natural runoff and forcing water to spread across the neighborhood like a slow, determined tide. He crouched beside the slab, tapped it with a metal rod, and shook his head with the kind of disappointment reserved for people who should have known better. The HOA president followed him around anxiously, trying to spin excuses about community improvement efforts, but the inspector wasn't buying a word of it. Standing near the ruined fence line, I watched as the inspector took dozens of photos, including the cut fence, the heavy machinery tracks, and the cement-covered water channel. He asked me for a statement, and I explained exactly what happened: the unauthorized entry, the trespassing, the ignored warnings, and the rapid concrete dumping. As I spoke, the HOA board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing their confident decision was quickly becoming a legal nightmare. The inspector's voice carried across the yards as he delivered the verdict. The HOA had violated multiple county drainage regulations, trespassed on private property, and damaged a natural waterway. Worse yet, the trapped water had now soaked deep into the soil beneath the homes, compromising structural stability. The board members tried to argue that homeowners approved the change, but the inspector made it clear that no neighborhood vote could override county environmental laws. By afternoon, emergency notices were issued, warning residents of potential foundation damage. Homeowners who once praised the HOA's project now flooded the board with angry messages. Meanwhile, I waited quietly, knowing this was only the beginning. For began with the HOA scrambling to control the damage, though their attempts only made the situation worse. Instead of accepting responsibility, they hired a landscaping contractor who clearly had no understanding of hydrology. His solution was to dig shallow trenches throughout several yards, claiming they would redirect pooling water. Homeowners watched nervously as he sliced long muddy scars through their lawns, leaving piles of wet soil everywhere. The trenches filled instantly, turning into miniature canals that did nothing to relieve the flooding. In fact, the standing water only spread further, creating murky, stagnant pools that smelled like swamp muck baking in the sun. By midweek, several houses reported moisture creeping through basement walls, and one homeowner found mold starting to bloom behind a storage shelf. The HOA president insisted these issues were pre-existing and unrelated to their project, which only fueled the residents' anger. People who once attended HOA meetings with coffee and polite nods were now showing up with printed emails, photos, and demands for answers. Tensions rose until arguments erupted in driveways, each homeowner more panicked than the last. Meanwhile, the county inspector returned with two environmental specialists. They examined the concrete-filled creek, took soil samples, and measured water saturation levels. Their conclusion was even worse than before: the blockage had changed the groundwater flow. Unless the obstruction was removed immediately, the flooding would worsen with every rain, potentially causing long-term structural instability. The specialists explained that reversing the damage would require heavy equipment, proper drainage engineering, and a full restoration of the natural waterway. The HOA board looked stunned. The cost estimate alone made several members turn pale. Homeowners demanded the board take action, but the HOA insisted their insurance should cover it, only to discover that unauthorized co. Ethan Reyes never expected his quiet Tuesday morning to start with confusion. He was halfway through his coffee when a thick white envelope slid out of his mailbox, the kind usually reserved for court summons or expensive wedding invitations. The return label read Sunset Haven Estates Homeowners Association, a name he had never heard in his life. He opened it, expecting some mix-up, but the contents hit harder than the caffeine ever could: a formal notice demanding $356,900 in unpaid HOA dues. At first he laughed, then frowned, then read the letter 3 more times just to make sure he wasn't losing his mind. He didn't own a home in any subdivision. He barely owned furniture. The only real property he had was the 300 acres of rugged desert land his grandfather left him, a place so remote even cell service avoided it. He dug the old deed out of his filing cabinet, the papers still smelling faintly of cedar from his grandfather's wooden box. The land was still his, untouched, unclaimed, unchanged. Nobody lived there. Nobody built anything there. Nobody even visited unless they liked dust storms and sunburns. He told himself it had to be a clerical error, maybe some poorly typed number somewhere, maybe a mix-up with another Ethan. But the letter listed his full name, his correct address, and worst of all, a stern warning that failure to pay could result in collections, liens, and potential legal escalation. That part made his stomach tense. By noon, curiosity had pushed aside irritation. He loaded water, snacks, and his grandfather's old binoculars into his truck. The dirt road leading to his land was the same as always: long, empty, edged with brittle brush. But as he drove, a strange unease crept in, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, like something was waiting for him just beyond the next rise.